Hi, everyone. We're starting right on time here. Welcome. I'm Michelle. My pronouns are she and her. I'm a communications advisor here at BC's Office of the Human Rights Commissioner, and I joined today as a settler on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations. Specifically, I'm calling in from what is known as East Vancouver. It's a bit of a downcast day here today, but there's lots of natural, beautiful light coming into my place, and I'm happy to be on stream today with our commissioner, Kasari Govender, and co-hosting with my colleague Jameson, whom I will pass on to introduce himself.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Hi, folks. My name is Jameson. I use pronouns he and him, and I'm an engagement advisor here at BC's Office of the Human Rights Commissioner. I'm currently sitting on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Hosainich First Nations, as well as the Lekwungen people, known today as the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations. With this acknowledgement, I want to hold my hands up to the Hosainich and Lekwungen people of the past and present who continue their ancestral relationship with the land today. With this acknowledgement comes the honor and responsibility of upholding Indigenous sovereignty of their land, their spirituality, their languages, and their cultures as well. Kasari, I can pass it over to you for an intro next.
Thanks, Jameson and Michelle. I'm Kasari Govender. I'm BC's Human Rights Commissioner. I'm so pleased that you're joining us all today. I am joining you from the same lands as Michelle, though a little bit further away. I'm on Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territory in downtown Vancouver. And as you've heard from both Jameson and Michelle, we offer these territorial acknowledgements not just to start us off in a good way here today, but also really to ground our work at the Office of the Human Rights Commissioner, which is both how we strive to do the work in a different way, in a different way that we might be used to as non-Indigenous people, in a decolonial way, but also in what forms the basis of our work or the substance of our work, which is a focus on anti-racism and particularly the rights of Indigenous people.
Thanks both. I'll now give a little background on our office. BC's Human Rights Commissioner, Kasari, is an independent officer of the legislature. BC's Office of the Human Rights Commissioner came to be in 2019 after 17 years in the province without a Human Rights Commission. Our purpose is to address the roots of inequality, discrimination, and injustice in BC. And we do that through education, research, advocacy, inquiry, and monitoring. So lots of things. A large part of this work involves identifying systemic discrimination in our society. That means taking a really close look at our current policies, practices, and the structure of our society. So whether intentional or not, systems that might seem neutral may in fact be discriminatory. This brings me to the video we're launching today. This video is intended to be an educational tool to introduce the concept of discrimination. And it's really only one piece of a larger suite of tools that we're developing. I'll talk a bit more about those later, but essentially, many people have a gap in knowledge around the topic of systemic discrimination. A common question is, how can systems be discriminating? Or there's a myth that we need to accept systems the way they are. For example, systems that have a particularly negative impact on women or Indigenous people or another group. And in order to move towards change, we need to first learn what systemic discrimination is, how it's deeply rooted in our society, and how we can recognize where it's happening. Only then can we address it collectively.
Thank you, Michelle. So today we'll be showing a video and discussing the layered subject of systemic discrimination. In this discussion, we think it's important to acknowledge that many different emotions can come up for folks. For some, there may be feelings of discomfort, and in many cases, we are shown that discomfort is actually a state that we shouldn't exist in. We hope to challenge that and remind you that when we learn something that may not correspond with how we usually see the world, working through those feelings can actually lead to transformational change. My friend and anti-racist educator Angela Mob Brown calls that stepping into the growth zone. So we really want to encourage folks to do that. Please take care of yourself during the session today and be mindful as you walk forward with this information too. As for the space that we're holding today, we ask that everyone together make this a safer learning environment by asking respectful questions and engaging with other participants in a good way as well. So before we play the video, we want to do a little Q&A with the commissioner. So Kasari, I want to ask you, as you're in your position, why do you think learning about systemic discrimination is important? And maybe you can talk a little bit about the video as well.
Sure. Thanks, Jameson. I think in recent years we've heard a lot about systemic discrimination, or we've heard the term a lot in the news, perhaps even around our dinner tables. And I'm not really sure that everyone understands the term because it's something that's sort of complex and needs to be unpacked. So it might be a term we hear, but not necessarily a meaning that's really transparent to all of us. And that's the gap that we're trying to fill with this video, to help folks understand how systems can be discriminatory, even when people are trying to do the right thing or just be decent and respectful with each other. So it doesn't all come down to that individual motivation. Many of us think of discrimination as being about stereotypes or slurs or outright exclusion. For example, a water fountain that only white people can use, like we know happened in the American South, or the residential school system here in Canada, which sought to obliterate Indigenous cultures and languages, among other goals. And even, of course, outright discrimination, like those examples can be embedded into systems. Those were embedded into law and policy, for example. And that's, of course, before social movements and legal advocacy and evolving social norms needs to change. But not all discrimination is explicit in the way that American segregation or the Canadian residential school system was, nor is it always about individuals treating each other badly. And that's when systemic discrimination can be a lot harder to see. Often we really need to kind of zoom out and look at the larger picture through trends and statistics to really understand it. When we understand, for example, that Indigenous youth are far less likely to graduate high school in British Columbia than non-Indigenous youth, then we can see that our school system continues to operate in discriminatory ways, even when that isn't immediately evident on the surface like it was in the residential school era. And although statistics can be very useful for understanding systemic discrimination, we also can't forget that those numbers reflect real people and their real life experiences. So we're doing education on systemic discrimination, such as producing this video, for a couple of reasons. First, because education about human rights is itself a human right that's been recognized by the UN, meaning that we each have a right to understand how our own rights and responsibilities work. How do we protect our own rights? And also because I strongly believe that if we don't understand the scope or depth of a problem, we aren't going to be able to solve it. So put another way, if we have the tools to better understand the world around us, we are better equipped to help make the world a better place.
Very well said, Commissioner. I appreciate you highlighting some of the why this is so important. In spaces for dialogue like this, we often hear the question, what actions are organizations like the office taking beyond just creating resources? Kasari, would you like to share a few words about what you see happening in this area?
Yeah, it's always hard, this question, to narrow it down. There's so much happening. And I want to emphasize that, the education work we do is transformative in and of itself. That's a key piece of the advocacy work, because again, we can't address the problem until we truly understand it. But my mandate as Human Rights Commissioner is to address systemic issues. That's it. That's not it as in that's a small scope, but that's it as in the question asked me everything that we do as an office. So I thought I'd pull an example, which is our policing work. So we've done a focus on addressing systemic racism in the context of policing. So one of the things we did is we gathered a lot of data on this. We did what we think is likely the largest project of its kind in Canada that's ever been done. We collected data on how do certain policing activities impact different communities differently. And we found, for example, that Indigenous people, Black people, and some other racialized communities, like what the statistics show as West Asian or Arab folks, also face disproportionate policing impacts. We made a report about that. We reported it to the legislature. We did a lot of public work about it. So really generating more conversation about the issue, and have pushed for our recommendations to government to be implemented. So you can see how sort of one piece of work connects to other pieces of work on systemic racism. And we will be producing some education work on that as well, to make that work a little bit more transparent to the public. And of course, we're not the only actors in this space. There's lots of folks working on addressing systemic racism and discrimination. I had the privilege of sitting in a press conference last week involving West Coast Leaf and the Centre for Family Equity, who had worked with government to work towards settlement of a case that meant led to widespread change in the family law legal aid system. So access to justice, particularly for women fleeing violence in their relationships. So that's just one other example of systemic change that's happening across our communities. So now that I've answered that question, I'm going to turn it back to you. Why do you think it's important to learn about systemic discrimination?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I appreciate your answer too. I think it's definitely an ongoing reflection for me. Yeah, I think it's important for people to learn about systemic discrimination because it takes the onus and weight of problems that can often feel really isolating in my experience off of the individual. So when we learn about the historic and ongoing ways that systems actually are functioning as they were made to, it makes sense to see why some folks experience advantages and why some actually experience barriers. I find that kind of learning creates room for less defensive and much more curious discussions, which I think is essential for this kind of ongoing learning. So that's kind of where I'm at with it right now. But Michelle, what about you?
Hmm. For me, understanding systemic discrimination allows people to realize it is a constructed thing. And that means that all of us have the power and agency to rebuild our systems in a way that is equitable, is justice oriented, and free of discrimination. This rebalancing of power and rights is visually reflected in our video. It's it's only 2 minutes long, but I think it beautifully gives a simplified version of this concept. We're excited to show it to you, so let's play it now.
When do we know we belong? When we're at home? When we have places to learn, chances to play, spaces where our voices are heard. For people who've always had these things, it can be hard to see or even believe that other people don't. That the systems we have set up don't work for everyone. They single some people out and leave others behind. Approximately 84% of Indigenous peoples in BC report experiencing some form of discrimination in healthcare. Working-aged people with disabilities are 21% less likely to be employed than people without disabilities. On average, women in BC working full-time earn 86.5 cents to each dollar earned by men. This is systemic discrimination. Discrimination in our systems benefits some and harms others. Intentional or not, the effect is the same. It builds a world of injustice and inequity. But we all play a role in creating the world we want to build together. We can listen to voices that are left out. And we have the power to challenge and change these systems. Because while we don't all experience the same barriers, we do all want the same thing: to belong and to be treated fairly and equally.
I've seen this video several times and I still love the animation style in it. A takeaway for me was that line, "We have the power to challenge and change these systems." It's especially resonant for me because I'm still stuck on that notion of agency. And it's true, we do have the power. Jameson, was there anything in the video that spoke to you?
Yeah, definitely. That agency piece speaks really powerfully to me as well. I think the visual of the cars at the toll booth really speaks to me as well. And the first time I watched it, I noticed that it simply displays certain cars driving quickly through the booth en route to their destination, while other groups of cars are held up by barriers. I think that that visual represents a lot of the ways that inequity shows up for people with different identity markers who experience systemic barriers.
That's true, I love that. These conversations can go so much deeper, but in the interest of respecting everyone's time, we will move on. However, if you want to have talk conversations about systemic discrimination in your own circles, we have discussion guides posted alongside the video on our website to help kick those off. Find them at bchumanrights.ca/systemic-discrimination, where we'll also be adding other resources in the coming months. One of our colleagues will put the link in the chat.
And I just wanted to say, moving towards the end of our session today, that we really wanted to acknowledge the time, the trust, the labor that our community partners have shared to help shape this project. We consulted with about 30 community members, including service providers and people directly impacted by systemic discrimination. And we also consulted with 12 educators who have professional and personal experience in systemic discrimination education. So we really wanted to thank all of those folks and all of you for your essential part in this.
Thanks, Kasari. For those who are interested in learning more, I want to share the resources we have and will have. There's an upcoming webinar introducing systemic discrimination on February 27th at 2:30 p.m. This webinar will go through what systemic discrimination is, describe some of its impacts, and provide tools to help you notice and address it. The registration link is also on that systemic discrimination webpage. There will be a part 2 to this webinar that will introduce actions anyone can take to respond to systemic discrimination in our community and workplaces. That part 2 isn't quite ready yet, but we will share it on our website when it is. Another item is the discussion guides I mentioned earlier. The systemic discrimination webpage will be our home for all things systemic discrimination related, so the discussion guides will live there. We have an experiential session coming, which is essentially a simulation to help people experience what systemic discrimination can feel like. And soon we'll also have an infographic to act as a visual representation of systemic discrimination. So stay tuned, lots of good things coming. That's all the time we have today. Thank you so much to Kasari and Jameson for your time, and to our colleagues working so hard on the back end to get the stream running smoothly, and to all of you for joining. Just cut that, Jocelyn. Just cut that. Okay. So that's all the time we have today. Thank you so much to Kasari and Jameson for your time, to our colleagues working hard on the back end to get the stream running smoothly, and to all of you for joining in, being interested, and staying curious. I want to remind you that this session is recorded and it will be available on our website. You can also watch the systemic discrimination video again on that page and access the rest of our materials. Thanks again, everyone. Have a lovely rest of your day. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Take care.